2024 general elections will be a watershed moment for both South Africa's electorate and political parties. The governing ANC is expected to face its toughest challenge yet from the DA and EFF at provincial and national level. In major metro municipalities across the nation, the ANC has already lost some ground. Joining us now to unpack what surprises voters can bring next year is political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. The State of the Nation address, I suppose the reactions have been spoken to. You yourself have spoken quite a lot about it, but I suppose the big factor was the Minister of Electricity, and a lot of criticism coming out of that appointment. 37 million rand a year, will it be worth it?
Good evening, Paul. Good evening to the viewers. I think you kind of captured a critical point, if not a significant issue, in terms of what the President's State of the Nation address on Thursday evening actually unveiled. And I think the question about the cost factor, because this is a big issue for the cabinet, for the president, in terms of reducing the kind of excess that actually sits in cabinet in terms of the bureaucracy of the state, and trying to trim that excess in the current financial crisis and volatility we find ourselves in. And adding another minister into the presidency raises questions about its efficacy, but also the effectiveness. I mean, the president mentioned very clearly that, and stated very clearly that the Minister of Public Enterprise will still remain a shareholder in terms of the kind of operationalization in terms of SOEs, that the Energy Minister will still remain. So the Minister for Electricity, I think at 37 million rand a cost to the state fiscus, is going to be critical in terms of how this is going to turn around, given the kind of economic crisis that we find ourselves in and the dire constraints that we find ourselves in terms of the cost that will take us to just get Eskom or get the electricity grid to where it should be, in addition to the other factors that prevail around the other SOEs like Transnet and so forth. So I think that's the big question in the minds of everyone, including ordinary South Africans, and definitely one that they'll take to the polls next year in terms of how the ruling party goes through its door-to-door campaign, its electoral strategy, and most importantly, I think also in terms of what it actually puts in, and not just for the ruling party, but also for all other opposition party as well, entities, is how they actually sell this coalition agreement. Because I think the city of Johannesburg is a very important indicator and benchmark of what not to do in coalitions.
Absolutely. I mean, you make mention of what it will all mean as we go into 2024. What we did hear today was Gauteng ANC chairperson Panyaza Lesufi saying that if the energy crisis is not resolved, it will mark the end of the governing party. Really quite telling of the strides and the work that needs to be done ahead of 2024.
Absolutely, and I think that admission by the MEC and by the so-called provincial chair of the ANC in Gauteng is almost an admission a bit too late, in my opinion. I think the writing has been on the wall for the longest time ever about what it means to be a governing party and what it means to have governance and credibility, legitimacy, and accountability. And those three kinds of ingredients, which actually makes up a much more larger set of benchmarks that you need to appraise yourself against, actually tells me that the ANC needs to be much more clearer and coherent. It cannot just wake up now and realize, hang on, we have a crisis at our doorstep or within our institution or within our party, and that we may lose next year's election. I think that has been a significant lack of understanding of what the feelings are of people on the ground, the level of trust, the level of legitimacy. And that's what we've been speaking about throughout this run-up to the State of the Nation address, even post-State of the Nation address, is the disconnect that ordinary South Africans feel from the governance and governing of this country.
With the metro municipalities across the nation, I mean, the ANC having lost some ground, what do you think would be some of the telling and perhaps most important lessons to be learned about what will need to be part of the coalition agreements? What sort of divisions and agreements would need to be put on paper for the party to make some grounds?
Well, firstly, I don't think they've lost some ground. They've lost incredible ground. I think the other indicator that we just need to mention is by-elections as well. These by-elections are happening, and we are seeing some significant trends emerging in particular areas where the ANC does have a traditional support. Even the DA, in some of the by-elections, you see some of the political parties, including the DA and the ANC, not fielding candidates. So I think this is, again, an indication of the smaller political parties who are willing to go right at the microcosm of our economic electoral heartland in terms of the support that they and the candidates they are willing to field. Coming back to your question about what needs to be done, I think very, very simply we need to understand that we are entering this framework of coalition politics, and we hear this constantly by commentators, media, etc., that this is now a part of the part of the political terrain in this country. I think the big thing for me is whether or not political parties are integrating these kinds of coalition strategies into their manifestos. And this is something that we need to start as civil society, as people on the ground, as ordinary South Africans and the electorate and people that are going to go to vote next year, depending if you are going to vote or not going to vote, depending. You've got to hold the political parties accountable when they come to their door-to-door campaign. I don't think sufficing with food parcels and giving people all kinds of frivolous gifts is going to actually give you the kind of traction you want. Because at the end of the day, there has to be some kind of formality around the election in terms of coalition agreements. Because what you saw in Johannesburg was really a kind of snubbing of the electorate in the city of Johannesburg in terms of how those coalitions played out, in terms of how those votes of no confidence played out, in terms of what you now currently have. And this is not just only in the city of Johannesburg, even in the Nelson Mandela Bay. So I think what is really important now is that we got to hold as civil society, as civic movements, including people on the ground, when you hear these election campaigns coming to your town, wherever, you have to start saying to them, to what extent do you actually talk about coalitions? Because once again, I think the idea is going to be to try and fluff around coalitions, mask the coalition agreement. And I think the South African Local Government Authority has some kind of framework document which needs to be applied much more effectively and in a much more critical way to say to political parties, we are not going to allow you to do what you did in the city of Johannesburg. So I think elections and election campaigning from now onwards has to have a critical dimension of coalition agreements and strategy. But then, of course, there needs to be an accountability also built into that as a fail-safe measure. Because that accountability means that if you are going to basically completely ignore the electorate and think that because you have been given a mandate at the polls by the electorate and that you can then go on and do what you feel is appropriate and in the self-interest of your own kind of vested political power and selfishness, then you've got to find some level of accountability. And I think this is where political parties will also need to be much more coherent and stand up and realize that it's not going to be business as usual when it's election campaigning.
And how much of an impact do you think the youth vote will be in terms of its significance? Could we see more young people going out to make their mark, or will that also be impacted, or perhaps the composition of the new ANC NEC, will that at all encourage young people to go out and have their voices heard? Because as you speak about the door-to-door, I recall ANC President Ramaphosa speaking about how as he's speaking and interacting with ordinary South Africans, questions like jobs and you know, young people in my home have no work, that has really come out very strongly.
Well, you know, firstly, we can't draw the correlation that if you have younger people in your NEC or in any kind of executive within any political party or organization, that it has a direct kind of correlation to bring the youth vote out and for people to vote. I think the very point that you raised at the end about what President Ramaphosa has spoken about in this door-to-door campaign, where people have highlighted that there are young people in my household that cannot afford to find a job. But remember, we've got a post-22 matriculant class who are essentially going to go into the economy and they're not going to find jobs because this economy is not creating jobs. And at the end of the day, you know, the question would be is how do you find and talk to the actual real needs, the real livelihood issues of young people, because they want to be able to access resources. They want to be able to go into universities and to come out with a degree that is sustainable, but one that is value-driven in terms of being able to become employable. And if you're not employable in this economy, it becomes very difficult. So I think, again, the question will be whether the political parties, irrespective of whether it's the ANC or other opposition parties and across the spectrum, we've got to be listening to and asking them, what is your job creation strategy? Because job creation and creating jobs is fundamentally two very important things. But you can't just talk about the structures or the conditions you need to create a job. A job creation is not necessarily one that gives you a sustainable or a job of security. And I think that's where employment security becomes critical. And if indeed we're going to spend 37 million on a kind of new ministry or minister in the presidency, the question then becomes is, how does that translate to ordinary people on the ground? How is that going to improve their lives, improve their upward mobility, their material status? And of course, once you create that, they create a multiplier effect in households. So again, load shedding has had a debilitating impact on the economy, but it's also had a debilitating impact on people's lives. And that is becoming a sore point, if not a point of apathy, where people are saying, well, if you're not going to resolve load shedding, you're not going to resolve energy crisis, you're not going to basically have better sanitation, healthcare, access to water, etc., why are we voting? And I think younger people are becoming much more despondent about the vote. And so this idea of keep repeating the kind of historical narrative in what came out in the president's speech as well, invoking the image of Mandela, etc., is very important. But again, younger people need to be brought in to be shown that this has an incredible impact for their lives and their livelihoods.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for weighing in on this discussion. Political analyst Sanusha Naidu.